In the 4th century BC, an Indian army marched along the Hydaspes River and took battle order near modern-day Jhelum. This region bordered the Persian Empire, but instead of Persians, they encountered a strange force clad in heavy armor under the command of the Greek general Alexander the Great. According to the Greek sources, Indian ones do not exist. Alexander clashed with King Porus in the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC. In a decisive battle, he defeated the mighty Indian war elephants, the renowned Indian longbowmen, and also the Indian cavalry and chariots, before turning back and leaving the defeated Porus to rule his newly conquered land for him. Clearly, India had a structured and organized army by Alexander's time, but we can't say the same with confidence for the Bronze Age civilization of Pakistan and India. Around 2500 BC, this region was home to the Indus Valley Civilization, at the time the largest civilization on Earth, exceeding those of Egypt and Sumer by quite a margin. It featured the most sophisticated roads, public water supply, and sewage system of its time. Unlike ancient Egypt and Sumer, modern scholarship regularly describes the women and men who inhabited ancient India as, quote, neither to have been a warlike people, nor have feared invasion, end quote. This claim dates back to the discovery of this civilization. However, it still resonates strongly today, not only in academic circles, but understandably also here on YouTube.
A civilization with no gods, no kings, no war.
A civilization without war.
But here's the most amazing thing about the Indus Valley people. They were peaceful.
When first researching this video, this claim made us skeptical. Upon further investigation, it turns out that there is a body of evidence and a lot of newer scholarship that justifies our skepticism. In this video, we trace the beginning of violence in ancient India and investigate how and when the first Indian armies entered the stage of history. In 1829, a deserter from the British East India Company traveled along the fertile rivers in the Punjab region of modern-day Pakistan. His name was James Lewis, but he became famous under his pseudonym Charles Mason. Close to the river Ravi, a tributary of the Indus River, he was gathering intelligence and searching for valuable historical artifacts. He hoped these would enable him to return to British service without too much a punishment for his desertion. An avid student of Roman and Greek classics, he knew that Alexander the Great had invaded India in the 4th century BC, and he hoped to find traces of Alexander's army and possibly even riches that they had left behind. But instead of Alexander's treasures, he stumbled upon an ancient civilization entirely unknown at the time. He discovered the remains of the city of Harappa, a metropolis of the Indus Valley Civilization. In 1842, Mason mistakenly assumed he had indeed discovered a ruin that had been described during Alexander's campaign, so nobody realized that he had found a far more ancient city. Over the next years, the significance of this site was entirely lost to humanity. Harappa was even frequently raided for its over 4,000-year-old bricks, first by locals, then by the British East India Company, which used it as track ballast for its 160 kilometers long railway track between Multan and Lahore. Only in the 20th century did archaeologists notice that Harappa was of far older origin. Much of that is owed to the Indian archaeologist Rakal D. Banerjee, who found a similar site farther downstream, the city of Mohenjo-Daro. He visited both sites multiple times and later wrote to the British Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, John Marshall, that he thought the origin to be, quote, remote antiquity. After more surveys, in 1924, John Marshall became convinced of the significance of the findings. On the 24th of September 1924, he stated in the Illustrated London News, quote, not often has it been given to archaeologists to light upon the remains of a long-forgotten civilization. It looks, however, at this moment as if we were on the threshold of such a discovery in the plains of the Indus." End quote. The Indus Valley Civilization was subsequently also referred to as the Harappan Civilization, after its first discovered site. In the next few years, countless cities were unearthed. All of them were clearly linked to Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. They had similar architecture and city layouts, and used similar seals written in the same script. An enormous ancient civilization, older than 5,000 years, was discovered. It featured an extremely advanced infrastructure, with public sanitation and sewage systems unknown to ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt. They predated any ancient Roman bath by thousands of years. One thing, however, seemed strange. For some reason, archaeologists found almost no signs of kings or high priests. Neither palaces nor big temples were discovered. And, allegedly, no mass graves and only few weapons were found. Already in 1931, John Marshall and a colleague of his, Ernest John Henry Mackay, concluded that, quote, "The people of Mohenjo-Daro appear neither to have been a warlike people, nor have feared invasion."
There is only war.
When archaeologists dig up the remains of an ancient civilization, they usually find all sorts of signs of societal hierarchies. They found houses of rich and poor people, graves of kings who were occasionally even buried with their servants, and objects underlining rulers' authority. But only a few, or even none, of these things were found in the Indus Valley. Indus Valley cities were, however, by no means smaller or less sophisticated than their ancient Egyptian or Mesopotamian counterparts. Quite the opposite. The Indus Valley civilization was not only the largest civilization at the time, a city could feature up to 45,000 inhabitants, but their cities also featured a street layout arranged in grid patterns, with major north-south and east-west streets intersecting each other. But that is not all. The historian Buryor Avari points out that a system of clean water supply and latrine facilities, by which waste was channeled off without coming into contact with clean water, was available to almost all houses, and most homes featured their own well. Moreover, the bricks of Harappan towns, the same that were used for the railway in India in the 19th century, were perfectly shaped baked kiln bricks, quote, which were all of a standard size, measuring 7 by 14 by 28 centimeters, with a ratio of thickness to width and to length being 1 to 2 to 4. End quote. However, because of the lack of big buildings, temples and graves, archaeologists assumed this society must have been egalitarian, without kings or high priests. Only one artifact exists that maybe depicts such a figure. It's labeled priest-king, but we don't know what function this person had or if the artifact even depicts a priest-king at all. The name is pure speculation and goes back to scholars like the before mentioned Marshall or Mackay, who also quickly noted that the Harappan weapons were of low quality and consequently not suitable for use in war. According to them, Harappan blades were much too thin, lacked the appropriate amount of tin or arsenic, and did not have a midrib, while Harappan axes were unsocketed, making them less resilient. Lastly, all weapons were found in ordinary homes, not in graves, and no depictions or inscriptions of battles or armies were discovered. So scholars assumed these items were tools, not weapons, and the Harappans did not have a distinct warrior culture. In the absence of any signs of battles, it seemed unlikely that the walls of the cities were used for defense, so they were interpreted as flood defenses. This is not unusual because floods were a major risk factor for all civilizations that lived along river systems. In Mesopotamia, many walls had a similar function. All in all, it is understandable that archaeologists thought this civilization was different, even peaceful. At the time, the assumption was not sufficiently challenged by the evidence. However, more excavations and further research do add a bit of necessary nuance to these claims. Firstly, Harappan weapons were not significantly lower in quality than most in Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt. Many Near Eastern weapons also had no midrib. Unsocketed axes were very common in Egypt, and we know for sure that Egyptians went to war with these weapons. Secondly, some of the walls of the Harappan cities could very well have been flood defenses, but others were certainly not. In Surkotada and Kalibangan, for example, archaeologists found bastions. Bastions serve exclusively military purposes. They are used to shoot alongside the wall at an attacker, not to stop floods. This is a clear indication that the walls had a defensive function. Moreover, gates with intricate corridors were found that could have been used to trap attackers. It is also not flooding damage that characterizes the ruins of many Harappan towns, but signs of burning. Especially between the early and mature Harappan periods, these fires seem to have been common, and often burned down entire cities. Out of 523 cities that have been discovered, 324 have burned down. This could indicate natural catastrophes, but these rarely affect so many cities simultaneously, so the evidence points more to social unrest or war. Still, Harappa, as it appears in the archaeological record, seems to have been different from Mesopotamia and Egypt. After about 100 years of digging, we haven't really found conclusive evidence of clear hierarchies, such as palaces or temples. However, there is some nuance to this claim too. Firstly, the citadels that almost all towns had were home to most public buildings, while the lower town featured buildings and remains linked to merchants and artisans. Secondly, the central planning that allowed for such sophisticated roads, sanitation and sewage systems, and the perfectly shaped baked kiln bricks suggests that some form of central authority existed. And thirdly, the trading system that spanned into Mesopotamia and modern-day Afghanistan also likely would not have functioned without some central authority. Maybe this wasn't a king or high priest, but some form of oligarchy, council or merchant's guild. We simply don't know. But there was likely some form of authority. We might have to do another 100 years of digging to determine how Harappan societies were structured and whether war was a common feature of life. However, in our opinion, the available evidence supports a skeptical stance toward an entirely peaceful civilization. One clear thing is that after 1900 BC, the Harappan cities slowly declined and many were abandoned. Most likely, this was due to socio-economic and environmental factors such as earthquakes. Modern satellite imagery confirms that they affected the course of the Indus and its tributaries and helped dry up the Ghaggar-Hakra River. It's usually assumed that the dramatic shifts in the river courses might have created floods that could have cut off the food-producing areas from the cities. This was made worse by a period of scarce rainfall and slow deforestation. Avari concludes, quote, "With the rivers shifting their courses, the rainfall declining, and sufficient food failing to arrive from the countryside, we must recognize a slow but inevitable collapse of the Indus system." End quote. This led to impoverishment in the cities. The sewers of Mohenjo-Daro, kept in good order and clean working for centuries, were clogged up with waste, which likely gave rise to disease and pestilence. Avari concludes, quote, "By about 1700 BC, the desolated Mohenjo-Daro had become a ghost town." End quote. However, the Harappans did not cease to exist, but migrated east. For example, those affected by the accelerated drying up of the Ghaggar-Hakra River resettled in the Ganga-Yumna Doab and Gujarat, leading towards the Deccan Plateau. 200 years later, by 1500 BC, the remainder of the Harappans encountered migrants from the Pontic steppe who slowly made their way into India. This began a new period of Indian history, the Vedic Age, which would not only bring warfare to a whole new level, but also Hinduism to India. In 1500 BC, the god of thunder, lightning and war entered the stage of Indian history. Indra, who is still a deity in Hinduism today, although of smaller relevance, was the god of gods for the people who now migrated to India. They called themselves Arya and pushed into the Punjab region from the northwest. We know of them because they left us some texts called the Vedas. These were only written down after 500 BC, but they existed as oral stories much earlier, probably as early as 1700 BC. They constitute the oldest layer of Sanskrit literature and the oldest scriptures of Hinduism. From the oldest of the Vedas, the Rig Veda, we learn that these people lived along the fertile rivers in the Punjab for many centuries as semi-nomads, herding cattle, but then began relying more and more on agriculture. They refer to themselves as Arya, but nowadays they're called Indo-Aryans. Side note, this has nothing to do with how this word was used in 1940s Germany. This term is frequently used in all mainstream literature to talk about this period of Indian history. In the Punjab, the Indo-Aryans were confronted by an indigenous people, who they refer to as Dasas or Panis, and by many pejorative names such as demons or cattle thieves. According to the Rig Veda, the Indo-Aryans, helped by Indra, the war god, defeated these people. So, in this period, war was clearly very much a feature of life. Competition for cattle, the best farming grounds, or resources in general were likely the main drivers of these conflicts. In terms of weapons, it's clear that they used chariots and bows. The Rig Veda characterizes Indra, the king of the gods and god of war, as mounter of the chariot. In addition, we also know that the Sintashta culture, from which the Indo-Aryan migrants originated, also used chariots. Bronze armor is also frequently mentioned, and it seems that the bow was the principal weapon. The Rig Veda states, quote, "With our bow we would win cows. With our bow we would win fierce battles. Our bow causes the enemy's dislike of us. With our bow we would win all the regions." End quote. From the Punjab, the center of gravity of the migration movement changed eastward to the Middle Country. This land ranges east from the Sarasvati to the Ganga plains, and is part of the setting of another text, the Mahabharata, a post-Vedic epic. The text informs us that new clan formations occurred in this time, and two dominant lineages emerged, the Kuru and the Panchala. They were two of the most powerful states, referred to as Janapadas. The settlement of the entire Gangetic basin was in full swing between 900 BC and 600 BC. After 600 BC, a complex state system encompassing princely kingdoms and clan states emerged out of the small polities of the Janapadas and the Vedic period. They are called Mahajanapadas and consisted of 16 kingdoms or oligarchic republics, and rapidly urbanized the way of life in India. New massive fortress cities such as Rajagriha or later Pataliputra were built, and ever more ambitious rulers, the Rajas, which means king, rose to power. Warfare and diplomacy resulted in the emergence of a single most powerful state, Magadha. Its kings, for example Bimbimsara or Ajatashatru and the later Nanda dynasty, built up a military system. It is in this age that we encounter the first well-recorded army in India, the Fourfold army. It was composed of chariots, elephants, cavalry and infantry, and structured similarly to a medieval lance. 1 chariot, 1 elephant, 3 horses and 5 foot soldiers made up the smallest unit of the army, which could then be multiplied by 3 to get to the next larger unit. Chariots were usually seen as mobile platforms for archers, probably to flank and harass the enemy. The Mahabharata indicates that the chariot was the vehicle that heroes and kings rode. However, some kings also rode an elephant into battle. In the army's early days, these huge animals carried 3 archers and their rider, but later more archers were added. Elephants were surely a psychological weapon, but also physically very effective, especially against unarmored infantry in compact formations, which was very common in India at the time. The infantry relied on light equipment. Most would not wear metal armor, but be equipped with shields covered in oxide, spears and swords. The archers used a form of longbow, according to the Greek officer Nearchus, who accompanied Alexander the Great on his campaign to Asia, quote, "The foot soldiers carry a bow made of equal length with the man who bears it. This they rest upon the ground, and pressing against it with their left foot, thus discharge the arrow, having drawn the string far backwards." Lastly, the cavalry was probably mostly composed of light horsemen, equipped with 2 spears and a shield. By now, India had a sophisticated and capable army that powerful outsiders would soon challenge. On a cliff about 100 meters above the ground, near the road between Hamadan in Iran and Baghdad in Iraq, there is a rock relief known as the Behistun inscription. It shows the Persian incursions into India, which were the beginning of external pressure on the Indian state system and army. During their incursions, the Persians conquered large parts of India. Among the 23 lands of the Persian Empire named in the inscription, 3 Indian regions are mentioned: Gandhara, Arachosia, and Makkah. Another 2 monuments even indicate the Hindish region, i.e. the Indus Valley, as Persian territory. In the 4th century BC, the Persian threat was replaced by Alexander the Great, who broke the Persian hegemony at the Battle of Gaugamela, which forced the Persian ruler Darius III to flee to Bactria. Alexander conquered all of Persia, marched through Iran, and by 327 BC he had nearly reached the western banks of the Indus River. However, neither the Persians nor Alexander ever attacked Magadha. They only came into conflict with what probably were minor states or kings in the Indus Valley, such as Porus, whom Alexander famously fought at the Battle of the Hydaspes in 326 BC. This battle is usually seen as one of his greatest victories, but how elaborate Porus's army was is unclear. He was not the king of Magadha but of Paurava, which we don't know much about. We do know that he used the same army structure as the other Indian forces, though. He positioned his elephants in the front, his chariots and cavalry on the flanks, and his infantry in the center, so it seems he followed the fourfold army model. The battle was certainly a clash of extraordinary dimensions. The Greeks had never fought elephants before, and the Indians had neither seen mounted archers nor heavily armed forces clad in iron and bronze armor. Alexander opened the battle by sending his cavalry against the Indian left, while his mounted archers distracted the Indian right. Meanwhile, a smaller hidden cavalry force was sent around the far Indian right to attack them from the rear, and the Greek infantry, heavily outnumbered, engaged the center. The Indian longbowmen, probably the most important part of the Indian army, were inefficient because it had rained heavily the previous day. When the Greeks clashed with the Indian center, the elephants wreaked havoc in their lines, reportedly even throwing some Greeks in the air. But after a while, the Greeks managed to kill the mahouts, the riders, and sent the beasts into a frenzy that led many to turn on their own infantry stationed in the back. Meanwhile, the cavalry fight on the Indian left was decided in favor of the Greeks. Together with the cavalry that had swung all the way around the Indian right, they now clashed into the Indian infantry from the back. This hammer and anvil maneuver sealed the fate of the Indian army. After Alexander's departure, the army of the first emperor in India, Chandragupta Maurya, still used the traditional fourfold army of old, so it was likely not as unsuccessful as the Battle of the Hydaspes might suggest. Chandragupta Maurya even maintained a standing army of large proportions. Later, he observed Macedonian tactics, which enabled him to defeat Seleucus, Alexander's successor, in Syria and Persia, but that is a topic for another video.